our next session. Starting them this morning, going through the experts, going through our list, are saying that we have a most choice expert community, and I've also said that Tatiana Vorozheikina is a person whom we have asked to come for 7 years. This may not be a compliment to us, but I would like to inform you of some technological moments. Then, and that's something that you might not be aware of, but Russia is a female country. But I don't like the gender talk. I think that there are not particularly any particular female problems. The only problem of ladies is men, and the only problem of men is ladies. All other problems are quite common. And Yuri believes that society is a common problem. Well, that's true. We will be deliberating some very sharp topics, but let me just repeat that even the most urgent, acute, and delicate things have to be considered with cold head and clarity. Thank you very much. After such an introduction, I would like to, cover myself up and then run away because you're afraid of a failure. But I'm very glad to have come here from this morning and to attend Natalia Zubarevich's lecture and Emil Payen's lecture. But having attended Mr. Payen's lecture and Ms. Zubarevich's lecture, I thought that they come from what exists. Mine, in spite of Lena's appeals, are also from what ought to be. So I called my presentation, May the Society Change the State, New Protest Movement and Revolution in Ukraine. I would be happy to talk about the revolution in Ukraine for a longer time. And I'm glad that there are participants from Ukraine who might correct me if I'm wrong. But what is important that I would like to, and this is of course a boundless topic, but I shall say a couple of disjointed things, trying to keep myself within these 30 minutes. As you know, from spring of 2011, the world faced huge street protests in the cities, in very different cities and urban centers of the world, all very different, which are indeed parts of the global phenomenon, which I would have called something as a self-organization of a society, which goes against the political system, which does not seem to express the interests of this society, or else when the society does not see the channels throughout the existing, to self-express throughout the existing political channels. So from 2011 through to 2014, while they were different in intensity, were distributed, if you move from west to east, they were started from Rio, Sao Paulo and Caracas, and of course Rio and Sao Paulo were the major centers, but then moving eastwards through to Madrid, Cairo, Tunisia, Istanbul, Sofia, Moscow, and Bangkok. All these protest movements are definitely united by the acute discontent and the dissatisfaction with the existing institutions, which disallow these people to express and to reach their goals through legitimate ways. This can be in case of the authoritarian regimes, as in Kiev, Moscow, or Cairo, or else in democratical regime like Madrid. Now, these may permeate the existing situation and takes the people out in the streets, trying to oppose the corruption and the insolence of office, or the actual repressive or authoritarian policies have spanned the world throughout the past years. So this arbitrariness in action has generally been considered to be unacceptable. And this opposition to corruption and arbitrariness or voluntarity were able to unite very different demands, from social stability and equality through to democracy and the demand for fair elections. And often this has led, as in Venezuela, to some unified front. It is difficult to describe these movements in traditional coordinates of the social and political science, because tens of thousands of people start to the streets primarily because they're dissatisfied with the existing political arrangement, where they're actually devoid of the right of voice and devoid of the right and the ability to influence the politics in their countries. In this sense, it is important that the impermeability of these political arrangements to common folk and the absence of men in these political arrangements has led to the mass street protests, and people are thus insisting on being recognized as full rightful actors. This is the generalized picture of these very different protest movements. I think they're all quite interesting, and I would like to stop on just several examples which might be of interest to me professionally, and because I'm a Latin American scholar, I would like, and there's one country which has long been enchanting to me by its problems, which is Turkey. I think this is a country which the study of which is a great intellectual challenge. Up until the 1980s, and starting from the Kemal's revolution, especially in the 1980s, this was a country which, to me, and to a whole number of Latin American scholars, as some piece of the big Latin American iceberg, and floated to Asia, because there was a big party of the left which was based on the trade unionists and the right-wing parties. It ended with the 1980 coup, which was generally viewed as a Latin American style coup. But what happened then? The situation started to change and leave this Latin American paradigm. Why? Because the specifics of Turkey was and is that this state-oriented regime established by Kemal Atatürk led to secularization and a certain modernization of the society, to a certain degree, of course, because, of course, what we mean by modernization primarily is the social institutions and the interpersonal relations, but of course there is also this institutional component which in Turkey was expressed and manifested in secularization, however, at the expense of civil freedoms. And the authoritarian tendencies in Turkey after 1980 prevailed. And as you might know, in Turkey, there's always been the Kurdish question, which problem consists in the states non-recognizing the Kurds as a nation and the ban on the language, to some concessions, but still the problem is there. So it happened so that democratization of an authoritarian regime from the end of the 1990s, where the headquarters of the Turkish military was the hub, and the moderate Muslim Party for Justice was indeed the locomotive of change. And after 11 years of its rule, we're seeing the great increase in these authoritarian tendencies, as already expressed by these new Muslim forces. So everything ends up in totalitarian, in the authoritarianism, both the atatism or this and this situation is resented by big fragments and big parts of the urban population in Turkey, which moving between these pendulums is sandwiched between the Muslims. And this is not just about the population of Istanbul and Ankara, but the educated Turkish middle class, and the actual expression of the protest was about actually the pretext was the liquidation of the little park Gezi in Istanbul. And this year, we're seeing a new wave of protests in Turkey related to an entirely different problem, which is what the Economist Journal said, not the protest of the White Turks in Istanbul and Ankara, but the protests of people in the mines and the miners' families, which suffered after the disaster in one of the coal pits, which led to hundreds of deaths and which caused the demand for the dismissal of the Turkish government and destabilization of the situation in Turkey. I would like to draw your attention to something that is still beyond the focus of the public attention. But what is important here is that to us as the Russian citizens, I would like to quote from the Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk's novel, which is called The Snow or The White, and the hero asks himself, the question is, on the one hand, I am a modernized, secular, democratic patriot. So he's thinking in 1980. And what do I have to put in the top of the pyramid, the enlightenment or the will of the people? If I first of all think and trust in the European enlightenment and education, then I have to see in the Islamists my foes, and I have to support the military coup, or else my chief loyalty, my chief commitment is the will of the people. And then, if that is the case, if I'm a Democrat, I have to support the people and to go against the military coup. So these are the liberations of the hero of this this novel. So the question really remains is that what do people trust in? This pendulum between balancing between the will of the people and the authoritarian tendencies is what definitely is at stake in Russia. Another subject, another plot of this mass protests, of which I know a lot more, is the Brazilian story. The Brazilian story is as follows over the past 20 years, and I will start with my personal impressions of 20 years ago. 20 years ago, in June of 1994, some might remember there was a soccer World Cup in the United States, and it happened so that in preparation was in Brazil. And at the moment when the Brazilian team played against the US team, I was going from Rio to home here I was flying Moscow for 2 months, leading to the soccer cup, to the football cup. I saw that the presidential campaign was stalled. Neither the people nor the newspapers were interested in anything but football. And I have to tell you that this was an extremely important presidential campaign when the president, Luis Ferdinando Barroso, was elected to lay the foundations for the modern Brazil. However, there was nothing for the people except for football. The people, the country, and I was very much annoyed. People were wearing verde amarelo, these woolen caps and scarves. I don't know how they survived. So I saw in this heat. So this was a true patriotic frenzy. In spring of 1994, when I was in Brazil, Ayrton Senna died during the race in Italy, which was, of course, the cause of the all-national wail and mourning. One journalist dared to write in Folha de São Paulo, and I said that he was a pioneer of the international and transnational corporations. He was all but killed, and indeed even the ministers of the Brazilian government said, how dare you talk in that way about the national treasures, of which one was Ayrton Senna. So today we're starting a new World Cup, and we're seeing an entirely different country. To a person like myself, who has spent so much time, studying this country, hundreds of thousands of protesters went to the streets, who are indeed protesting against the gigantic costs of this football cup and the stadium construction. They are against and they say that the national colors are not particularly fashionable, and there is not much advertising. And 20 years ago, the situation was extremely the opposite. What happened in Brazil? The protest started 1 year ago with the protests against the transportation, the increase in the transportation costs. São Paulo is a huge city of 20 million people. It has a metro. However, the buses are a very important means of city transportation, and the cost for a round trip was 2.25 euros, which is not particularly high by our scale. However, this is the highest ratio between the salary and the cost of a bus ride. So people went to the streets. However, the protests were very soon spilled over. And one has to remember this slogan. This is not about the cents or centavos. It is about rights and dignity. The people who went to the streets of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro were saying, It is about keeping our rights. It is about observing our rights. We have want to be the subject of the law. And I also remember this lady. 20 centavos is our park of Gezi. So how do people indeed perceive themselves to be a part of these mass movements? The geography of the protest immediately swept to the major cities of Brazil, in the south of the country, and even in the north east, the most retarded part of the country. And these demands and claims and slogans very soon went against the low quality of the infrastructure. And indeed, the Brazilian buses are not bad at all by the Moscow standards. However, people hate them and for how they run, and the protest very soon went to embrace the situation with the universities, the healthcare, and general social services. So, what preceded these events in Brazil? Why did the country change so radically in 20 years? This was the result of a social policies started by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and then and while he was the right centrist, and then the following left centrist government. Natalia Zubarevich referred to me this morning. Indeed, Brazil is the country with the highest level of inequality in Latin America. The top 20% have over 50% of gross national revenues. So the Gini continent is one of the highest on the continent, and for the past 20 years, especially, this has been decreased. I will not go deeper into this, but you'll have to trust my word that because of these social measures and the struggle against poverty, the people finally, about 1/3 of all families, started to get some small benefits. They started to be paid for money on condition that they take their kids to school and inoculate them against disease. Because the vicious circle in Brazil was such that the more children were leaving the elementary schools, the less qualified people could be created by the country. And this was the vicious circle which was reproduced in every generation. So both Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Lulu started their crusade for the high school education to become mandatory. And the economic boom also played a role. And the middle class, something that they call the middle class, which is the people who are no longer in the informal sector and for the first time received or obtained bank cards. They started to pay taxes. These people en masse went to the streets as for the first time they perceive themselves to be taxpayers. I would like to refer to this hearkening to the morning presentation by Natalia Zubarevich. The people who 20 years ago, when I was working in Brazil, lived in utter poverty, indeed total outcasts from the economic standpoint. The police would not dare entering the city districts where they lived. However, they felt themselves to be taxpayers and demanded to be treated with dignity and to be rendered social services. Today, Brazil is a country with one of the most well-developed and a powerful civil society in Latin America. The Corinthians Stadium, where the football World Cup is opening today. This stadium was created in part on the territory which had been occupied by slum districts which had been liquidated.
Although these people didn't enjoy any legal rights, like all poverty, these settlements, illegal settlements, they just came to seize this land and build illegal construction. São Paulo saw strike by people who work on transport. So what I want to say that the country has changed so dramatically, so that all the calls for soccer patriotism, which used to work, that irritate me so greatly, because when you open a newspaper and if they mention election, it's only which candidate would benefit from the victory of the Brazilian national soccer team. And if they lose, then it would find it dangerous to return to their country. So they no longer appeal to soccer patriotism. And in this sense, I really envy Brazilians, because soccer, to a certain extent, in Brazil, it's something like our cream. Our Crimea is our back house. It's again opium for people. And my biggest plot, they made me what I like it. I really like speaking about these countries. I would like to hear your opinion. The third line is about Ukraine. From my viewpoint, Kiev Maidan is all about a unique phenomenon alongside among these global trends. What is unique about Maidan? First of all, most of movements that are enumerated, with the exception of Tunisia and Egypt, have never achieved their goals. Brazil, the situation is now specific, because they're going to have an election in autumn, and certainly the government will have to make some concessions. Certainly they could not say no, that we will not hold a championship, but the salaries, they will increase the wages, they will release those who went on strike and were arrested, because the situation is not popular. But nevertheless, and many analysts look at it. One publicist in Venezuela says there's a huge disproportion about huge energy of this demonstration and very small, insignificant practical outcomes and results. So we'd like to speak about this gap, but at the end of my presentation we will look at Ukraine. In the Ukraine, the results are there. They overthrew authoritarian regime. They achieved change in political government in the country. Secondly, Kiev Maidan was the longest and probably the most movement that enrolled most in terms of number of people. For 3 months, it successfully opposed violence by the government, and at its height involved anything between 500,000 and 1 million people. Thirdly, I think very much like in Arabic countries, it is in Kiev where people demonstrated exclusive stubbornness and stamina and mass readiness to go to the end and even die for their own goals. And this is the perception which I think has been the factor that resolved the showdown with Yanukovych in favor of the popular revolution. I would very much like to talk about the reasons why in Kiev, why in Ukraine in general this happened, but I do understand that I have very little time left. That's why I will not discuss the reasons for this, although it's a very interesting plot, especially given as compared to Russia. I would say only one thing, that what served as a trigger of this event. As you know, the trigger was when they had the situation about concluding a treaty of association with the EU. Here, the symbolic importance of Europe, where Europe served as a symbol for self-determination and bringing together the part of the Ukrainian society that was against growing authoritarianism and corruption in government. I suppose it's very substantial, and in general we should say that it is the European choice for these people. People actually went out in the streets about European choice, about rapprochement with EU. For the Ukraine, it looked like a gradual way to set up transparent economic and political institutions that would be accountable before the society and not to oligarchical clans. Another thing that makes it different. So this is where it's important to understand the symbolic character of this European aspiration. But when we look at Ukraine and Europe and at its Ukrainian policy, we would see that, first of all, Russian investment, Russian gas matters more. It's not an ideal Europe, but the Europe that mobilized people to protest in the Maidan. I suppose it's some kind of idealistic Europe that existed only in their mind. In a certain mind, it is a challenge for Europe per se. Is Europe really up to the mark, up to the Europe at which, like it is perceived by Ukrainians? Again, about the reasons. Well, what made people go out into the streets? The very fact that under Yanukovych, corruption became absolutely total and there were no limits, there was no stopping it, much stronger than what it was under previous regimes. It also played like a role of a trigger. But for me, what is very important for me, that is on the one side, as you probably know, they saw gradual suppression by Yanukovych's clan, despite all the implicit agreements of almost profitable areas of activities when he subordinated tax system, judicial system. Elder son, here information differs, he became one of the top 5 richest men in Europe. And in the conditions of stagnation, of falling living standards and utter poverty, we tend to forget that Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in Europe. In terms of per capita GDP, I suppose only Moldova is lower than Ukraine. In Ukraine, in terms of PPP, it's 7 something thousand US dollars per year. It's lower than Serbia and Montenegro, than Bulgaria and Romania. So given this utter poverty, which pushed dozens of thousands people abroad to go gastarbeiter, sometimes for very menial jobs and very hard jobs. You're all young people, but I face the situation of Ukrainian babysitter and nurse, because all the hospitals in Moscow no longer work, because the personnel doesn't do anything. Once you appear there as a relative of a patient, a company comes and says, look, you may hire a nurse or rather a person who will be taking care of your anything between 1,500 to 3,000 rubles per day, and 2/3 are grabbed by this company. So it's very difficult. This work 24 hours a day. When I brought her a portable bed and put it next to my husband's bed, she told me, well, you know, nobody has done it before. So people sleep as sitting on the chairs. There is no room for them, and nobody gives them any living conditions. And they are the ones responsible to doing, and they're working for a pittance. And it is something that's in en masse. And they tell me that in Europe it is the same. I've heard that in Milano, the best attendants, nurse attendants, are Ukrainian women. So this also became a trigger. And this is something that spread both against entrepreneurs, especially among small and medium business, as well as some people in the streets. Yanukovych's clan, who became richer and richer by grabbing the state budget, this is something that made them furious. This is something that does not make us furious, but it makes them. And I like the expression by the independent trade union of Donbass, Nikolai Valenko, who put it this way. It is taxpayers who went to protest in Maidan, who didn't want to be grabbed and to be looted any further. But it's a very important thing that people understand that this is their money. And again, Natalia Vasilyevna spoke about it. We have just the idea that it does not come from out of our pocket. It's because of oil and gas that we pump. No, it's actually exactly the tax which we don't pay on our own. They deduct it. In Russia, I understand they also deduct it from people's salaries and wages. But since the economy and the country is smaller, they see a clearer link between this. For good reason that entrepreneurs accounted for were one of the most numerous professional groups in Maidan. In early February, there were, as Ukrainian sociologists said, they were about 17%. But then their share in early February grew to 17. It was somewhat smaller before. So mostly people who said they were small and medium business. So much for the reasons. If we speak about what was Maidan like? Again, in the Ukraine, they have very good quality and serious studies that show that what can be seen at the face of it, but that actually there were three different Maidans that took place. One Maidan as a rally, another as Maidan as a Vichy, like a self-made parliament, and the third is a siege like a military camp of Zaporozhye Cossacks. And there's a world of difference between them. What is it, shall I put it, what was typical of Maidan? I suppose what was typical is for these things that I'm discussing or trying to discuss with you today, first of all, inbuilt distrust for politicians. As sociology says, about 90% of people who protested in November and December, it's that they didn't belong to any political or social organizations or parties. It was just self-organization, pure and simple. And the third most important component of this Maidan as a rally and Maidan as Vichy or town's meeting, I suppose it was non-violence. Original distrust of protesting politicians had to do with the obvious reluctance to repeat the experience of 2004, when mass protests were used by the opposition to come into government, but they did not bring about either economic or political reform. But if you look at it in terms of what should have been there, I've been looking at it that we need to create a new political nation, and that self-organization of the protesters should become something that will be a predecessor of these institutions. Nothing like this happened. This self-organization institutions that could transform this protest into political sphere and become political organization. This is something that Ukraine didn't see. Example like this exists. There are two examples. They are Polish Solidarity, that was set up as a public social organization under authoritarian regime and later turned into a political party, political force that came in charge of democratization process. And the second important, this is the party of labor of the workmen rather in Brazil. That was not a party in times of dictatorship. They were just trade unions in Ford and Volkswagen factories in the suburbs of São Paulo that brought together people both in terms of economic and, since it was an authoritarian repressive regime, they brought them together against dictatorship. Then, based upon this trade union structure, a party of workmen was set up that is now one of the ruling parties since 1993. So not only two examples. In Ukraine they did not do it, although there was demand. There was a deliberate demand for this, and it was very relevant because they kept speaking about it. The entities or structures that could have, again I'm saying, structures of social organization that might turn into a political and economic government, a very important feature of Ukrainian protest, and this is where I fully support Pine, although we are opponents in many cases. This is a very important difference of Ukrainian Maidan and Russia's protests in 2011-2012. This is the difference between them. I would put it this way, that spontaneous protest in Ukraine that was not based to any political party, it was because of unprecedented geographical and economic representation of the population of the country in Maidan. Anton Oleynik put it this way: for the first time in post-Soviet space, we can see grassroots mobilization in such huge numbers. Not only representatives of a new creative class, main hope of Russian liberals, They mixed together with small business, intelligentsia, engineers, workers and people from the country. Maidan indeed was about sociological slice of the Ukrainian society, and not just people who live in the city and who are pretty much well off. Sociological data is very interesting. That really says that indeed most people first were best educated with university degrees. Their numbers would go down, but their share still remained much higher than the number of people with university degrees in Ukraine as a whole, as a country. So if we speak about professional representation, then, as I told you, the share of entrepreneurs would go up, the share of students would go down, and remain unchanged like 10-13% is pensioners and workers. Indeed, unlike Moscow and St. Petersburg, it had the slice of the whole society of Ukraine, not just one class. And it would be interesting to look at geographical representation. First, in Maidan, as a rally, as a meeting, first, Kiev dwellers accounted for 50%, and later it went down to 19 and 13%. And respectively, the share of those who came to Kiev, especially from Western Ukraine, was growing. So it turned from intelligentsia sort of led, urban, it became more pro-Western, more country-like, because although the share of people from Western Ukraine never exceeded 52%, and about 20% were people from Eastern and South Ukraine. So much for social and geographic representation. Another important problem that has to do with the topic I am discussing here today is self-organization. At the start, as I was saying, they mostly thought they would go for non-violent process, and when this protest became violent, many people regretted it. And since non-violent protest helped increase the potential, enhance the potential of moral and political supremacy over the police and the government, people felt that they had the upper hand. And as one Ukrainian researcher said, he put it this way: all of them, means those who opposed neutral Europe, they realized that not one single and more expensive imitation of activity cannot compare to what ideologically motivated people can do. But after the 19th of January, the protest turns violent. Maidan, as I put it, becomes more provincial, more pro-Western, meaning Western Ukraine, and somewhat more organized. So in January, February, it's mostly where people who belong to some social or public movements. And people who were non-affiliated with any movement, their share was still very large, but it fell from 92 to 70%. And at that time, since they turned violent, they formed this amorphous civic showdown, turned into military self-defense. And self-defense became the form of military and political organization, which turned Maidan radical. And elements of civic self-organization, such as kitchen, medical care, and scenes, and it all a stage that was set up for orators. It it lost its relevance. So this rough standoff with the militia and these military-like structures had little to do with this new, transparent political institutions for which Maidan originally spoke for. And as I told you, elements and of these institutions, they rise, as it successfully happened in Poland and Brazil, as they fought authoritarian regime, and during the process of civic self-organization that can go in and hand in this. Since in Ukraine it took more a military character, it assumed more traditional forms. And the last point I wish to make is that it's a question to which extent the outcome of Ukrainian revolution in the 3.5 months, to which extent they coincide with the goals in which sometimes paying the price of their own and somebody else's lives, hundreds of thousands of people. Well, this question may seem idle to you in the situation when Ukraine became victim to uncovered military aggression by Russia that annexed the Crimea, and Russia continues with a policy of destabilization in the southeast. To which extent this question could be relevant? When I attended a congress in Kiev, many of those who spoke from the Ukrainian side would say that actually under threat is the very existence of Ukrainian country. And best reforms, it's best to postpone them till better times. From my perspective, these better times, and this is what, as a person in comparative, these better times would never come. But the window of opportunity after the overthrow of the old regime, it opens only for a very brief period of time. And if you do not use these opportunities, they never can be implemented, but the inertia that reproduces old institutions, all types of relations between the government and society, they're usually huge. So from my perspective, Maidan set this question very roughly. There's something that is common for most protest movements in today's world. How to close the gap between society and political system. How to bring together popular people's movement, people's revolution with politics. How can you translate it into policy? How can we avoid old oligarch machines who would make use of protest to meet their own ends? These processes are still open. I'm just rounding up all the pros and cons, to put it briefly. Whether the potential of democratic transformation is still there in terms of transformation of government, given the extraordinary conditions, what are the factors that work for, or which are the factors, there are many more numerous factors that work against it? I would put it this way. There are certain things, some things that work against it. First of all, Maidan, that so desperately spoke against politicians, including opposition politicians, are several times watched on Ukrainian television, their public television, their broadcasts from Maidan. It was really pitiful to look at Klitschko and Yeltsin when people protested against them and wanted to talk to people. So this all-potent Maidan turned out impotent when the government. But the Virtue or town assembly, people's assembly, cannot take part. And there were no institutions who could relay this experience into a representation. Secondly, military weakness. Ukraine never got ready to wage a war. Ukraine, this is where the army is not only weak to oppose not only Russian inaction and first diversion groups, and then there's self-organized volunteers that Russia supports. But this, I suppose this is something else. But those who speak about poor combat worthiness of the Ukrainian army, they are really getting distracted. Chechnya has made them forget that Chechen war, that people now have to face their compatriots, both armed and not armed. This is a psychological barrier. Well, that is hard to overcome, but regrettably it can be overcome, and this is what we see happening right now in Donbass. And another very important issue here is that it's not so much the army as the police that face the need to change their loyalty. They had to turn sides. They had to switch sides and take the side of those who yesterday, in the times of Yanukovych, were their enemies. That's why I'm saying that military weakness of the country is an obstacle towards its democratic transformation. Because when all the strength goes to build the army, otherwise in this situation there is nothing you can do, this fully makes not so important all other objectives, but Ukrainian state is weak, not only in military aspect, it's very weak in political and administrative aspects too. And this is where, as I think, we see not the best development of events, although it's also something that is forced. Administrative structures of the state are corrupt and serve the private interests of the clans that have economic command and control of a certain region. This tendency between the merge of personal, political, and economic government and power is strong. I will give you the names. On the surface of it are the names of chair of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast administration has become Igor Kolomoisky, one of the biggest entrepreneurs. His younger partner, Igor, I don't know, Palitsa or Palitsa, is in charge of the administration of the city of Odessa, and Sergei Tarota controls metallurgical production in Donetsk region, is the head of the administration of Donetsk region. So this sort of something that is relevant and works for 1 minute in terms of management decisions, yes, we can understand. But we can recall Zhvanetsky, he says, those people who have something, this is what they guarded. But I suppose you may not remember, but he had a very interesting joke, and this is what comes, just a short story. To which extent these decisions help create accountable political institutions that would report to society? Well, I suppose they will take them very much in the opposite direction. And the same problem is being reproduced at the national level, because Poroshenko is also a biggest entrepreneur. So the story of a merge between the power and capital and the state really is a great obstacle. What is a stimulus? In my view, or an impetus for further development, I suppose the level of self-organization and self-realization, realization of a need in reform as a precondition for survival, and amongst others, survival of the Ukrainian as a state. As one woman put it, I forgot her name, she said, reform is an instrument of bringing the country together, because both in the East and in the West we face the same problems: corruption in utility, house hospitals, kindergartens, militia that abuses its citizens, and courts that want bribes. If we want to change this situation, then reform, since they're dangerous, they're the most dangerous thing, that this is more important, that would bring the country together, although it might seem outlandish to us. So on the other side of Ukrainians who say, despite the war, despite all these horrors, reforms should be carried out. What reforms are we talking about? About decentralization of government, about the reform of local self-government, about ensuring the balance between the government, branches of government, to ensure and guarantee the rights of national minorities, the reform of legal relations between society and the state, and reform on law enforcement and judiciary. The question is, who can carry out these reforms, given this small window of opportunities that is still there? How can we create working democratic institutions in a poor country that is, besides, is being torn apart by a conflict that is spurred from a side? And how can we go and not stop at autocracy and oligarchs and Maidan, which will turn into a violent crowd whenever it dislikes something? So all these questions are still pending in Ukraine. At that, I suppose I would stop. I would like to tell you about the lessons that we can draw from Ukrainian experience, but I suppose I would better stop at that and leave some room for Q&A. So, dear colleagues, questions Q&A. Boris was the first to raise his hand. Boris Grozovsky, please, now has the floor. Well, Tatiana, thank you very much for the brilliant presentation, which I enjoyed really. The question is, in Latin American countries, it often happened that revolutions in the long run would lead to semi-socialist regimes, populist, and so on and so forth. In Latin American history is rich in these events and transformations. Do you think anything like this could happen in Ukraine, given pretty strong socialist traditions and attitudes and moods of the masses? And second, in a situation where some government and state institutions, as you pointed out, they have this process when somebody is seizing power in the state, like state administrations are not governed by state institutions, but rather follow business institutes of groups that are elites. And on the other side, a number of functions that should be supposed by the exercised by the state are non-existent.
And what are we going to talk about? What are they going to do? And are they going just to grow state functions in their new shape and form in this standard administrative regime, or they want to do something else, a new model which is not known in the CIS countries, completely different, when some functions they migrate to the society, to social movements, and the state has a subordinate function. So thank you. Thank you. And with regards to your first question, so about the implications of the revolutions in Latin America and then the Ukrainian prospects, I can tell you that the socialistic or socialist or kind of pseudo-socialistic revolutions, they've been only a few. Cuba and Nicaragua, only two. But populism is much wider spread, so in more developed countries. So that goes back to the 30s, to the 50s of the 20th century, all the way up to the 70s of the 20th century. Classical populism in its classical shape and form, from Venezuela to Brazil, and in other options. And I would say about populism the following. So first, the change of the type of relationship between the state and the economics, and because this is the state that does the import replacing industrialization, and so the beneficiaries, not only industrial institutions are included. They do this import replacement effort, but the wide masses of the population and the market itself and the industry. So this is the populist social bloc. The state, then businessmen working for the protected domestic market, and the workers who are involved in this process are the beneficiaries, because not only as customers, but as those who get social benefits. All social systems spring up to being at that time. So if populism is regarded as that way, then so that's exactly what was done in Soviet times in eastern Ukraine. So I don't see this to repeat. But if we talk about more modern things, and then there's the following phenomenon, and it only is true of Ukraine, Russia, Venezuela. It's true of all this. It's not important what kind of economic policy the authoritarian regime will pursue. It's important on who it relies upon. Because if it relies upon exclusively on the strata depending on the state economically, I mean state public officials, who they're paying pensions to, and thus, so they ensure their survival, political survival. So, like for example, Putin regime, if you select, and the Venezuela Chavez regime, and so when all the economic and social activity works only for Chavez, and then in Venezuela, so there is such a beautiful thing. So then. So there's a polyvalent bourgeoisie, meaning that the people from the administration of the clan of Chavez who seized the most profitable areas of economic activity, and they're quite happy with that, and they kind of But they are so they're closer to the regime and they don't oppose it than private businesses. So this danger exists and exists in Ukraine. This is a general threat, a danger. This failure to include susceptible, vulnerable politically and socially into the institutions that would allow them to achieve their ends through political channels, and not on this clientele of the paternalistic structures of the state. And so then the paternalistic trends of the bottom and the totalitarian tendencies of the top, they can merge together, and so when they merge together, so they will that's the way it's being reproduced all the time in Latin American countries. So with regards to Ukraine, so Poroshenko came to power under different slogans, completely different slogans. You probably heard his opening speech. He spoke about, so he wanted to separate the state from the society. He wanted to gravitate towards the West. So then in his inauguration speech, usually is not important. But he is involved and he is biased to another type of development, and so he is committed. He is committed to this type of development. And so what's interesting, so the Brazilian example is very interesting because so then the system is democratic in Brazil, but there was, so I was so much envious when I went to an election poll during the municipal elections in São Paulo. It's completely different between what they have and we have. I was so envious when I saw this is a working democratic system, and I was so envious when I saw the election campaign, how the elections were going on. And so the party that came to power democratically was 3 times re-elected, and it relies on its social beneficiaries, and this is a very powerful connection, a democratic, close cohesion. So I'm sorry that I'm so prolix, but the absence of the state in Ukraine and how the state will be built. Let us see. And actually, I was thinking at the beginning of the 90s in Russia, because the collapse of the state against the background of strong civil society, maybe it's good. If we look at kind of the zero-sum game, it's okay, because all the niches that the state leaves are filled in by by organized civil society. That's exactly what happened in Mexico. So then the civil society, after the earthquake of 1985, so when the state actually was not capable of doing anything, all of a sudden, like a mushroom, there's so many self-governance organizations, and so they took all the capacities and opportunities that the state was doing, so they started to do it, and they filled in for the state, and excellent, and they did very well. And all of a sudden, so Mexico became the strait of strong civil society. So then. And then the strong municipal government and regional government. But there is one condition. It's certainly the presence of strong civil society. In Ukraine, it's stronger than in Russia, the civil society. That's why I would not exclude this opportunity. But it does not exclude, it does not cancel the necessity of building efficient political institutions that would cooperate with those public institutions, but not replacing them. And so then decentralization of a certain return of function of self-governance, public self-governance, but you cannot liquidate, for example, so the police should work, because if there will be no police minister of interior, then under the slogans of the left or the right sector, so they will start to burglarize companies and steal and kill people, or on the other side there will be no rule of order, a rule of law, and a complete breakdown of law and order. So the police will need the police. And so, but the more transparent they do it, the better. And I think that both opportunities can play out. So we continue. And so you please go ahead. Mm-hmm. Thank you. My name is Alexander Vasiliev. I'm from Nizhny Novgorod, and I would like to answer to ask a question about our foiled revolution of 2011-2012. What was it, and why we experienced the fiasco, and the revolution was aborted, and what lessons we can learn from what happened in Ukraine. What lessons? Thank you for this question, because this is what I was going to tell in my last part. And so I'm sorry, because this is exactly what I wanted to tell you about. And so I'll try to answer this question. So what are the lessons of 2011-2012, Russian 2011, and the lessons that we can learn from Ukraine? First point, I would in Marxist traditions, I would form it that the strong engine of mass action without the proper pulleys, so will be idling without pulleys and connections and gears. So if there is no structure that would support, lead, guide, and will be doing the routine work, all this will phase out and dispel and disappear. And that's just in Russia, like in any other countries. It is true of other countries, so this negative effect was aggravated by the accumulated distrust to opposition leaders and opposition parties, and disbelief in their ability to head the mass movement. And this is it. And so all the leaders were in the same position, in the same boat, like Yatsenyuk and Klitschko. They were on Maidan. But so the difference that those were parliamentarians, that's the difference. The other we can explain that. So we needed not so much new leaders, not such, because there were some leaders like Navalny, for example, but the new structure. People realized that because during the Moscow elections, so there were many slogans in support of Navalny. Like that. It's not about Navalny. So people understood that they don't want a new leader. They don't want any. Some of them, not talking about Navalny. Not so much the leaders, but the structures that would communicate and accumulate the accumulated potential of protest activities, and the democratic and political migrated into this. And in absence of such institutions, such structures, so then the public inspiration turns into discontent and disenchantment, and there was absence of success, because the movement needs a success story to continue, and the absence of other political considerable changes. The second point, no less important, is, in my view, the most important weakness of protest movement is the capital, because it developed mostly in Moscow, and to a lesser extent in St. Petersburg. That was the movement of minority. And if we go back to Anton Oleinik, who quoted Ukraine, so that was the movement of unnecessary people in Moscow, in the other capital, because they are ousted, because they didn't have the right to express their own opinion, and they were unhappy, indignant, so they were kicked out. It was a political protest of the middle class, but not in the scale-up understanding of the Brazilian approach to this issue. And what's more important, what was negative, because it was perceived in this fashion, not so much by the participants, but by the media and independent analysts. So what I mean by that? So then it's a simplified interpretation. The middle class opposed not only the authoritarian power, but a lot of lumpen proletariat who were raised intentionally by the power. So I'm quoting Latinina. So those are the freebies and the stupid cattle, the rabble who do not want to protest against anything. So because they were against power, they were against because unlike rabble who cannot survive without their paternalistic state, the middle class fight for their freedom and honor. Unlike that rabble who want the state to help them all the time. So this way it turned into charity. And for these, there were grants. This pro-Putin performances in Moscow, when people were saying, as long as it doesn't get worse, and so I'm happy with what we have, etc. And that was the level of relevance of this two-pole perception. We are not them, and they are not us. And because the weakness of the protest movement was in its inability to include social requirements of the majority of the population, the democratic processes. That's exactly what happened in Ukraine, what's happening in Brazil. So it was announced as its strength. And suddenly the power immediately took advantage of this. So they used the self-presentation of protest movement. So the protest was sold out on TV to the population as the movement of the rich against the poor, as the office loafers against the society. And that laid the foundation for a successful isolation of this protest movement. And that was aggravated after Putin came to power for the third term. And as I was saying, and in my view, so the agenda of the democratic movement in Russia, and I keep repeating it like a parrot in all my publications. It should include social interests of the strata dependent on the state, the budget, pensioners, and definitely so the public officials and the public sector people who get salaries from the state. We need to include them, involve them, because when pensioners in 2005 went to protest against the abandonment of the of monetizing their breaks, their benefits. So they went to the streets, and so there were thousands of them, and they had to repeal this change, and they returned the benefits for the pensioners. Or for example, crucify Khodorkovsky, or we're all for Putin. So what kind of dignity is that? It's not coherently mingled with social characteristics and its income and his income. Primitive picture. And so I'm deeply convinced that without the representation of the interests of this stratum dependent on the state and in political institutions of the position, so democratic movement will be doomed to failure, and it won't work. And so this inclusion of social requirements and inclusion of social structures. If we do that, we could hope for success. Thank you. Thank you. Me or? Oh yeah, we have half of our participants from Krasnodar. So please you. Sergei Gurtsev, Krasnodar. So I love soccer and I live in Krasnodar, so that's why my question has to do with both. From your presentation, I've been watching with the championship, and it turned out that the Brussels community got some levers to influence the government and the championship. Yes, concerning the championship, the cup. So they took this championship, World Global Cup, as a hostage, and now so we have protests. The port is closed. So the image attractiveness of Brazil collapsed, plummeted, and I don't know just why. So the image went down. And so then, like we spoke about some time ago, so then the investment attractiveness so can always be connected to the image attractiveness. And if we apply it to Russia, does the society have the right to blackmail the government? So, for example, if the fare on the Moscow Metro goes up 5 rubles and will boycott will boycott the Sochi Olympics, for example, can we blackmail the society, the state, if the state acts against us? And so maybe and then in Krasnodar regions, actually, the special agencies immediately got to work. A very interesting question, by the way. I would say that here, and in case of soccer and the Sochi Olympics, we need to differentiate the state and the society. In whose interest the Olympics were held? In the interest of society? No. But certainly it was organized in the interests. It was publicity. It was image campaign of the ruling regime, and personally Putin. His successful event, and to a certain extent the same was happening in Brazil. So although just I like Brazil. I like their party and I like their history. It's a unique phenomenon. Is the party of labor, so went up and grew up strong, and so 3 terms in a row, and so everyone likes and respects them, and started to work for their own image, and the championship, a global championship, and the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. So those are the white elephants, big projects, but very costly. When you read about the success of Brazil, you can see the figures, the changes. Then, for example, last time I went to Brazil, and with all my background, and I saw the people, sleeping on the streets in the central thoroughfare of São Paulo. Or Rio de Janeiro. So you kind of sober up when you see their travail and misery. And but when the state starts asking you to make sacrifices, so we need just to differentiate, to put it apart. So whether the Brazilians are doing right when they're using the championship global blackmail. Blackmail is too negative connotation. I would call it differently. So they're attempting they're working for their own interests. In my view, there could be a different angle to it. In my personal view, so this evolution that occurred in the last 20 years in the society, when they start to perceive themselves as a taxpayers, a society, and desire to distribute the means the way they like it, in my view, it outweighs the negative image things that occur. We know that the airport is closed down. I didn't know. I think that the airport was fine. It's very difficult to get from the airport downtown because there was a strike in the metro as well. They suspended the strike, but I didn't see any news today. But so I am on the side of the society. If Brazil did not have any elections, then certainly the special agencies would work. So the Ministry of Interior just would start to work, and so it's very big. So they just have troops everywhere in all poor regions. So just to squash the drug cartels. Drug cartels, they want to show, because the Ministry of Interior is everywhere, so the troops are everywhere just to squash the drug trafficking. And so this is, and so unlike, but the elections, it makes up for it. I think that's a good development of the Brazilian society, because I'm not a fan of soccer, although I went to saw the soccer matches. It's interesting. People don't kill each other. They're singing. They're happy. It's so much better. Don't fight. They don't get into fist fights. Yeah, but still. So this when this government is headed by, if they lose elections, and then the center and the right coalition gets to power, it will be the change of power. It will be great achievement. It will be not cementing this populist regime, not ossifying this populist regime, but there will be a change, and that will be for the better. Ukraine woke up. Good, Alexei. Let's give the word to Ukraine. Freedom to Ukraine. Gerenko Alexei, Ukraine, Sebastopol, and recently living in Moscow. I'm very thankful, deeply thankful for this wonderful, very interesting, very broadening, capacious, deep, insightful, and so so there is nothing. There is nothing to correct. Everything was so wonderfully described that I can't add anything to it. And so there is always just a vacuum of quality presentation of the news, and it's great that you've hit the nail on the head. So your description of the situation was so accurate. So it's a great day, so the day of Russia, and I celebrated several years running. But compared to the last year, I can see that Russia is moving towards independence, and so dependence on the authority from the people, independence of the authorities from the people. And very soon I'll be going back to Kiev, so for a number of reasons that I see that, and I witnessed that some of the society becomes verbally very aggressive, very aggressive. It's because if everything goes well in Ukraine, and if Ukraine starts making progress, and I hope for that, then they will start looking for the fifth column. So they will certainly find the fifth column, those who are the traitors. And the question has to do how the young people, the Russians who want to live in a rich country, don't want to live abroad. How can they oppose these times of the troubles? What can one person do to fight the authorities? Because I'm using this opportunity, I'm selling this article about Ukraine, so which will be in my last edition of Pro and Contra. So the article of Pine has already been published, but the Carnegie Foundation is being closed, and so there will be a big article in that edition. So the one which I relied upon when I was talking to you. So then Ukraine, the illusions that have not yet been lost. So then Pro and Contra magazine, and it will be on the internet, on the web. And I'm not so sure that I'm a neophyte, so I never dealt with Ukraine, never studied Ukraine. So, and when Marie Lippmann asked me to write this article, I wanted to, because I started in January. I never read anything just besides Ukraine, so I was watching Ukraine events, and so I was trying to understand. But it was very, very difficult for me to write this article. I was very much engrossed, interested, and so I'm just trying just to I want to offer you this article so that you could read and comment upon it. Concerning Russia, I think that what has been done in Russia in connection with this anti-Ukraine campaign and the media against Ukraine, and then the conquest of Crimea and general approval of the Russians. Certainly this has corrupted the society greatly, because the society, they sent a strong message to the society, and those who are strong, those are right. So be on the side of power, of strength, and you'll be right. I think that the society, the Russian society, understood this signal correctly, this message correctly, and I cannot imagine the demonstrations with slogans. Let's send tanks to Kiev. It would have been impossible to see such slogans in December, October, but now just they are appealing to the Third World War, and so send tanks to Kiev. So this message has been absorbed by the Russian society, and the message was received well. And another, I want to give you a quote that everyone should know from the high school. Everyone should know that quote. So with peasants, so he was very strict to his peasants, although they loved him, so because they were happy that the boss was so rich, and so hoping for his support. So where it comes from? This is Dubrovsky. Naturally, almost hit the bullseye. Yeah. Yeah, so this is the peasants of the noble guy Troy Kurov to his boss. And so no one reads this story, but this is very important. For example, so the seizure of the village Kistenyovka, where Pushkin actually just goes back to the classical documents of how Kistenyovka was seized. It's a raider seizure, forceful raider seizure of the 19th century, because who has the power, has the strength, is right. Because this noble guy, so this boss, who the landlord, so was the epitome of the private power. And so the main problem of the Russian state, because it's not a state, it's a combination of private interests that are formed into something that we refer to as the state. In this sense, there is no state, because behind each state institution, from top to bottom, from bottom to the top, so there is always a specific boss who has vested interests. And what do we do under the circumstances?
It seems to me that we can do something. An authoritarian regime, unlike totalitarian one, cannot control the entire environment, and there are some gaps. In Latin America, under even more repressive regimes, civil society did survive and even got strengthened as the means of non-political resistance. So I think it's our way too. And should we want to have some strong political structures after some time, we need to have strong civil, non-political structures now. They can be totally apolitical. I'm talking about all volunteer organizations, any self-organization that makes society independent from the state and equal partner. Those are the right things to do. And the authorities, it's only natural, the authorities view it as their death threat, and they realized only to them. And for me, the law on volunteers was a signal. Looks like those volunteers went to the Krimsk city to help those who suffered from flooded. And immediately the law was applied, and those volunteers had to register. And that implies that on every level, in every dimension, the environment is to be kept under control and free from any idea, from any manifestation of freedom. Dear colleagues, the time is up, but I'm afraid of Mr. Shmylov. He will take a revenge on me if I don't give the floor to him. I'm Alexander Shmylov from Moscow. I'll try to be very brief, although I have a lot to say. Just ask yes or no. I'm afraid it will not work. I would like to revisit some previous questions when you were explaining the reasons for failure of protests in Russia. In my view, there is one more reason, which is quite obvious. If you look at Moscow of 2011, 2012, and if you just look at Kiev in 2013 and 2014, in the Ukrainian squares, there was many Ukrainian flags. They were singing the anthem of Ukraine. They cried, "Glory to Ukraine." In Bolotnaya Square in Moscow, it was impossible to imagine. And this is the typology of protests, and there is a feeling that in post-communist world, it's only the protests that where a liberal component is added with some nationalist rhetoric, that only such a combination can be successful. It is the same in the Baltic states, in Georgia, in Ukraine. Thank you very much. I think it's a very important question, and I'll start from the end and say no. I think that the events in Tunisia and Cairo in Egypt, the overthrowing of Mubarak, they ruled out that component. And the main force came from students and secular population. and they were joined by Muslim brothers who, after that, and because they were supported by the majority of the population, they turned into the ruling party. So it's not always about nationalism, but if you make a sign of equation between nationalism and religious, probably you are right. I would paraphrase your statement and say that a democratic movement alone is not enough, and there should be some additional element. And again, here comes the Russian situation. And personally, I don't see any opportunities for democratic revolution or revolution and any kinds of Russian nationalism. And for me, it was quite uncomfortable to walk with those people all the time at those rallies. I should also admit that when the latest rally took place against the invasion of the Crimea on March 15th, and I thought that finally all things went well, but I was not irritated by the leftist movements, but they also supported me. But so, in an empire, ethnic nationalism is always linked with imperial symbols. And I mean that even this very dangerous stake of the regime on the ethnic nationalism, which means saving Russians and Ukraine, it was the slogan. I asked myself a question, what are they? Who are they? Am I Russian? My grandmother is Ukrainian. And it came to me for the first time, how we will differentiate between those people? Shall we take blood tests? And I think that it's the proponents of empire who support those Russians, so-called Russians. And what you saw in Ukraine, singing the anthem, and one a friend of mine who came from Ukraine said that, look at those people, they are proud of singing their anthem, something that we cannot do. So we need to find some other grounds, and I don't believe in nationalist foundations. And speaking of Ukraine, it seems to me that this particular component that belongs to so-called right nationalism, but judging from what I read and from my conversation in Kiev, the role of the right sector and Mr. Yarosh is upplayed very much by the Russian television. Ukrainian researchers say that that association was never known before that. The association, which is called Freedom, was known, but all other groups, named after Stepan Bandera, they were not known. And secondly, those people were well equipped, unlike other fighters in Maidan. And third, those groups were well financed. So in Ukraine, many people have a feeling that it was a provocative force that was set up by Yanukovych to just make provocations. I cannot judge on that, but speaking in broader terms, it was exactly the component, the nationalist component, can hardly be appeased with democracy. And Ukraine, is it a state of the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian nation? And Mr. Yarosh said in an interview that it was a state of the Ukrainian nation. And he was quite unambiguous. And I don't think that only Yarosh thinks along those lines, and Tignibok thinks the same, and we saw the results of the elections. I can remind you of that. One of them polled only 1.2, the other 1.5. Rabinovich polled 2.4, more than the former two gentlemen put together. and that's the indicator that tells us that the Ukrainian society is healthy. But I think that the problem exists. It does exist. Because in modern world, nationalism runs counter to democracy, even in that liberation movement. So, Alexei, Rabinovich is gaining strength, and it gives us some more food for thought. So, dear colleagues, I think we had an excellent session, and it's true. Tatiana Evgenievna was invited a long time back ago, but some more events took place in the interval, and I think that it's not the last time we see her here. It would be my pleasure to come again. And I don't think that I'm so exclusive, just I didn't receive those invitations. And I'm really impressed by the quality of your questions. I spent the entire day here, and it was really my observation that you asked well-qualified questions. Thank you very much.